Okay, can you hear me? All right. Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to this talk this night, which is part of our, the Department of Sociology and Anthropology's annual speaker series. And tonight we have an exciting sociologist from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, Alford Young Jr. He is assistant professor of sociology in the center and also a professor in the Center for Afro-American and African Studies. He got his bachelor's degree from Wesleyan University and master's and PhD from the University of Chicago, which is indeed one of the world's renowned sociology departments. His research is in the area of urban poverty, sociological theory, and African American intellectuals. He's published extensively in journals like the Annual Review of Sociology, Sociological Theory, just to mention a couple of them. He has a forthcoming book that's entitled The Minds of Black Men, Making Sense of Mobility, Opportunity, and Future Life Chances, which is coming out through Princeton University Press. He's also spoken at a number of universities, some of which include Columbia University, Northwestern, Texas A&M, and of course Wesleyan. We're very lucky to have him here this evening with us, and tonight the talk will be titled Making Sense of the Minds of, is it women or men? Chicken. Yes, Making Sense of the Minds of Black Men. And this actually draws from his forthcoming book. So ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming Alford Young.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you so much. I want to first of all thank Professor Jackson and her colleagues in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here for bringing me out to address you all this evening. I certainly do apologize for bringing a part of Michigan winter with me. I thought that I'd have the opportunity to escape those conditions for at least a 2-day period. And indeed, I share not only myself, but a little bit of that climate in a very literal sense with you all this evening. I come to you this evening to talk about a population, a group of individuals that has been very much a point of concern in my research and in my thinking for almost a decade now. And indeed, you've already heard a little bit about who these individuals are and the particular slant or take that I have in thinking about them. My forthcoming work, The Minds of Black Men, Making Sense of Mobility, Opportunity, and Future Life Chances, is a qualitative study of some low-income African-American men from the city of Chicago. And in this work, I attempt to explore how these men, in essence, conceive of social reality. Right? Specifically, how they think about mobility, opportunity, their own sense of life chances, but set within a larger notion of how they think mobility unfolds in American life. So a major part of this initiative, a major part of my agenda as a researcher is to try to look at how individuals who appear to be on the margins of the social world conceive of the structures, the processes that shape everyday living, and to what extent they perhaps imagine a place for themselves or imagine their own situations in relation to those broader processes and structures. And I argue that this is very much a Chicago story. By that I mean that I take seriously that this research was vested in a city that has suffered hyper-segregation, so much so that large numbers of low-income African Americans in the city of Chicago have very limited access to interaction with non-African Americans. Indeed, very little access to interaction with African Americans other than those that share their low-income statuses. And in that sense, it provides what I hope to convey is something about the complexity of urban living. Clearly, notions of the crisis of the black male have loomed large in the past 2 decades. There's been some clear sense that this crisis is situated in the urban context and has much to do with the kind of urban blight and decay that's a part of contemporary living. I certainly don't argue against those perspectives. But what I hope to bring to you today, among some other points, is to understand the specificity of the Chicago situation as a way of thinking in more complex fashion about the complexity of urban living for different individuals. My own work was centered on the west side of Chicago. The south side is perhaps the more well-renowned, certainly the more researched. Large-scale public housing developments like the Robert Taylor homes, other developments, have garnered much of the popular attention when the media takes a look at Chicago, takes a look at issues like urban poverty. My interest was in going to, in essence, new terrain, a new environment, to see if some of the same stories and situations would play out in a different population. So I headed west, of course not very west, just to the west side of that city, and grounded myself in an area that was as impoverished as the south side of Chicago. And we'll talk in a minute about those situations and those circumstances. But essentially, I went there to tap into a community that had not been as thoroughly explored, had not been as thoroughly investigated as the south side had been. And I brought with me to my project in Chicago an awful lot of my own experiences as a young man born and raised in New York City. I'm something of a unique life historical circumstance in that although I was born and reared in a chronically depressed urban community, I am actually from a very solid middle-class family. Throughout my early childhood, my adolescence was clearly from the wealthiest family that I knew in my community. And one of the things that intrigued me, that excited me throughout my younger years, my early adulthood, was the extent to which, as I moved through life, I moved from a position of thinking very much like the young men, and in many cases the young women I grew up with, to thinking very differently about my own life chances, my own prospects, and more specifically how to navigate the social world. What also struck me, though, was that at a certain level there were some similarities in thinking about how external factors could affect one's mobility. The extent to which race may play a role in one's prospects for getting ahead. The extent to which access to money or other material rewards may play a role in factoring one's getting ahead. And so I left the East Harlem section of New York City to begin my own studies, thinking in the back of my mind that there was this odd combination of similarity yet difference in thinking about my own prospects, my own thoughts, my own pattern of mobility, and the young men that I left behind in East Harlem. I went on to, about 10 years after leaving East Harlem, to arriving in Chicago and deciding that I would ground myself and ground these very issues and concerns in a formal research agenda. And it is one part of that agenda that I want to share with you today. In essence, that agenda was to take an alternative look at the so-called crisis of black men. I certainly don't challenge or dismiss the importance of documenting social ills, social concerns, social problems affecting this population. Indeed, my own research agenda is predicated upon other scholars so carefully documenting these findings. But what I thought, what I continue to believe throughout my research, and what I aim to argue today, is that amidst a lived experience of crisis, of despair, of turbulence, there are some unique and particular ways in which individuals think about themselves and think about those experiences that perhaps can register an alternative understanding of the prospect that these individuals have for a better life. That there is something beyond an explicit social problems agenda that we can bring to the table in thinking about the situation of low-income African American men and the American social landscape. That, in essence, has been the policy-centered, or the more public dimensions of my research agenda. I've also had a more formal scholarly objective, and that has to do with creating a space for what I argue is a different cultural inquiry on this population. And by that I mean that there's clearly been a history of rich cultural investigation into the case of the African American male in the urban community. And that cultural inquiry has often foregrounded notions of norms or values and pays significantly less attention, in my view, to other dimensions of the cultural, such as belief systems, meaning-making, other processes that have to do with perhaps some more mundane or basic aspects of how people apprehend the world around them. But it seemed to me, in the same ways in which these processes of apprehension happen in unique form with me and my peers in East Harlem, that they would play out on the west side of Chicago. So I chose to document that in my work. Now, to say a little bit more about this cultural approach, one of the things that I drew from my work, and in fact that I centered my work in, is this long-standing effort for ethnographic researchers to, in their own way, make sense of the everyday lives of low-income black men. And a large part of that project has centered on looking at the public dimensions of African American low-income urban living. When I mean the public dimensions, I mean those kinds of studies that I'm sure we're familiar with. The street corner, right? The public scenario, the visible spaces. And it's clear that for individuals that don't have access to or cannot acquire much private space, that the public becomes a very important domain for the production of everyday living. Right? So it's quite natural that in this tradition of research, the urban ethnographic tradition, that this commitment to the public would take shape. Right? That's where these men seem to be to a large extent. That's where life unfolded for them. As significant as this commitment to public inquiry has been, is this extraordinary reliance upon norms or values as some of the guiding logic for cultural inquiry. Now, to be clear, I don't dismiss, I don't aim to erase what this legacy of inquiry into norms and values has done for situating a rich understanding of low-income African American men. But I think it can be supplemented. Before moving to discussions of how to supplement that tradition, let me say a few words about how I've come to understand it and how it situated my work. Although one can look at perhaps 100 years of study of low-income black men in the urban context to really get a sense of the power that was invested in concepts like norms and values, one really doesn't have to look far back beyond the 1960s, when in an era of significant debate and dialogue about the culture of poverty, these two analytical constructs, norms and values, seem to garner a lot of public attention. Right? The simple question on the table is, what might be going on in the lives of black men that make them make behavioral choices that seem so different than what the rest of us do? What is it that's driving people to take actions, make decisions that the rest of us apparently don't seem to make or take? And it's quite clear that with that lens on this population, issues of norms or values would emerge as central. Right? The normative quite simply referring to the rules, right? The rules and the sanctions for behavior that exist. And a range of arguments throughout 1960s ethnography, up until the contemporary, that looked at alternative normative structures, right, that shaped how African American men responded, that gave some purchase on understanding why it is that men joined gangs, engaged violence, sold drugs. Right? Yet at the same time, this emphasis on values helps cement some notion that black men weren't altogether exotic cultural creatures. They were argued to be like the rest of us because they adhered to a standard American value system that was centered in the aspiration for upward mobility, a value for the good life, right? A value for getting ahead, for contributing to one's family. And so by and large, we're talking about an era of research where the normative dimension was the space to think about difference, to make sense of alternative behaviors, to make sense of choices, actions that didn't fit in with what the so-called mainstream pursued. Yet the value dimension created that space to see overlap, similarity, some consistency across these populations. Now, certainly there's been much debate, much discussion about the legitimacy of that kind of framing, various discussions about whether, in fact, low-income black men adhere to different normative structures. Right? Perhaps the values debate has been less critically pursued because there's some general sense that all people want the good life. Right? So as we think about what Elliot LeBeau said in his work, Ulf Hannert said in Soul Side, Lee Rainwater in Behind Ghetto Walls, right? Not much critical interrogation of the value dimension, just some affirmation that, you know what, these people that are impoverished want what the rest of us want. Yet the normative dimension was used to make sense of difference, contrast, distinctions. I argue, and I'm certainly not alone in arguing this, that as we've progressed since the 1960s ethnographic moment, that cultural inquiry on black men, in particular, on low-income populations more generally, has really suppressed a more vivid, a more central consideration of belief systems, of meaning-making, as an appropriate domain for cultural inquiry. And when I refer to meaning-making, I mean the understanding of how it is that people make sense of options and possibilities in their lives and the ways to attain them. And so we're not simply talking about meanings as constituted by an understanding that being a lawyer is better than being unemployed, right? Being a doctor may provide more returns than being a cab driver. I mean understanding how one navigates access to those positions. How one conceptualizes the risks, the barriers, the obstacles that may get in the way of access to those positions. How one conceptualizes the resources, the mechanisms, the means that may facilitate access to those positions. All those are at stake in a critical exploration of meaning-making. And it's that dimension of cultural inquiry on low-income African-American men that I feel has been underdeveloped in an assertive attempt to make sense of norms and values for this population. Now, I research and write in a moment where some other scholars have begun exploring some of these very questions and have created something of a small-scale scholarly community in urban poverty research to begin debating about this very perspective to cultural inquiry. I refer specifically to works like Catherine Newman's No Shame in My Game, where she looks at young people that work in the fast food industry in Harlem and New York City and considers how they make sense of that means of employment for ascertaining other objectives, goals in life. I also take into account work like Sudhir Venkatesh's, who in a book entitled American Project did a detailed analysis of how a gang in a public housing development in South Chicago functioned not simply as some profligate entity in the community, but as one of the only formal organizing mechanisms in that community, such that material rewards, benefits, the kinds of resources that in some ways benefited the members or other young people for getting ahead were distributed. And Venkatesh, in his work, very carefully explored why it was the case that some individuals, upon completing college, still maintained a commitment to their gang. Not simply because they were maladjusted, but because in making sense of their everyday lives, still in public housing in South Chicago, needed to maintain those ties to access certain ends. All right, so this pattern of inquiry has, by this point in time, been very clearly situated in urban poverty research. My effort has, in large part, has been one of trying to take the argument even further. So that a part of what I've done is drawn upon some aspects of cultural inquiry that have rarely been brought into the discussion of the urban poor as a way of creating more space to think about beliefs, to think about meaning making. And most specifically, I've drawn upon the symbolic interactionist perspective to help me along this way. And when I mean symbolic interactionist, I mean the more classic approach by Herbert Bloomer and his contemporaries that looked at how it is that patterns of social interaction created a sense of understanding about social reality. So that chair is a chair because those of us who function in this room or in other spaces where that device is present relate to that device as a chair. There's nothing inherent or essential about that piece of material that makes it a chair. But we organize our lives and function in a sense that we create for other people this coherent understanding that that's a chair. Well, I think that process has some bearing in understanding what's going on in low-income communities. And it's significant for understanding how it is that individuals make sense of their reality. Through patterns of social exposure, patterns of social contact, ideas, understandings, arguments, interpretations about reality get shared, get crystallized, get transmitted, that create for individuals a very clear sense in their mind of what is, how things operate, what the processes of everyday life are all about. And in the absence of some critical moments that rupture those understandings, these orientations become commonsensical, right? They become the common sense for people. And some of these patterns of common sense are shared by individuals that don't have access to this world, and have little, if any, contact with low-income, predominantly black communities. In some cases, these understandings are particular to people in this world. In much the same way that there was difference and similarity for me and my peers in East Harlem in New York City. Now, another critical dimension of this kind of consideration is that I'm looking at low-income African-American men. I'm talking about a population that suffers from a high degree of social isolation, meaning an absence of exposure to people of higher socioeconomic means, people that have access to other material resources, what have you. So individuals that by and large have people that share their status as their social world for interaction. Indeed, their social world is saturated with such individuals. So that again is a part of the critical twist. And all that is something of a scaffolding for the actual empirical work that I've done. I want to use the remaining parts of my conversation today to highlight some examples of contrast and similarity and how a set of men from the west side of Chicago think and talk about work, opportunity, and mobility as a way of illustrating further how this mode of cultural inquiry can enrich an ethnographic tradition that is previously centered on norms and values. We will see in some cases some strong overlap, in other cases some strong contrast. And I will point to specific life historical conditions and factors that help us come to terms with how it is that certain individuals can sound so much alike in speaking about the social world they're a part of and the broader social landscape, and why certain individuals can appear to be so different. The cases that I draw from today come from a community that, by mid-1990 standards, was about as poor as one could find in urban America. The median income for families in the formal Near West Side community area of Chicago was about $9,000 per household by mid-1990s figures. And the communities were replete with the kind of social ills that one can imagine a part of any depressed, socioeconomically depressed community. The specific neighborhood that I draw my cases from today is comprised of the Henry Horner Homes public housing development on the west side of Chicago. A development that, as we speak, is being torn down as a part of Chicago's commitment to decimating public housing and apparently establishing in its place mixed income or at least improved housing prospects for its residents. The jury's still out about how that process will unfold. But prior to the end of the 1990s, the Henry Horner Homes stood as a complex of 19 buildings with slightly more than 1,700 units, almost all of which were occupied by African Americans. And according to statistics compiled by the Chicago Housing Authority, over 85% of the households received some form of public assistance in the mid-1990s. Indeed, only 8% of the households were supported solely by the employment of one or more members of that household. The Henry Horner houses had been perhaps made best known to people like yourselves by the publication of Alex Kotlowitz's There Are No Children Here, where he drew his two cases from that housing development. And in his work and in much of my research, one of the striking points for understanding the social dynamics of that community is to understand how situated the Henry Horner Homes is in a series of gang pockets throughout the west side of Chicago. Indeed, the Vice Lord Nation, one of two major Chicago factions, pretty much controlled the eastern border of the Henry Horner houses, the time at which I did my field work in the mid-1990s. And it's references to the Vice Lord Nation that run throughout some of the commentary that I'll share with you today. Let me say, before moving to discussing some of these cases, that my access to this population actually came about through my previous contact with community organizers on the west side of Chicago. While one might find it a bit odd or at least difficult for an individual to have access to low-income black men, and not simply access, but to get men to sit before oneself and talk at length about their lives' experience, I should tell you a bit about what facilitated this process. The community organizers that I came to meet were essentially well-respected figures in the community. In one case, an elderly woman who was seen as a mother figure to many of the men in the community. In another case, a young African-American male, slightly older than the 20 to 25 age group that I was dealing with. But in both cases, individuals that had the attention and direct contact with the population I sought to interview. Through resources provided to me by the University of Chicago, I was able to pay the men that I interviewed $25 for the completion of a formal interview. For many of these men, this meant the only legitimate money they earned in their early adulthood. And rather than talking to men about their gang activities or their involvement in violence or some of the more profligate or extreme dimensions of their lives, my research centered on some very basic, fundamental questions. I asked the men about their life experience in terms of what they learned from family, from schools, from friends about getting ahead. What they thought about what they learned, if they learned anything at all. What they thought about their schooling experiences. So 1/3 of our dialogue dealt essentially with life history. 1/3 dealt with their understanding of how mobility and opportunity unfolds in American life. So very straightforward questions. How do people get jobs in American society? What do people need to know or do to get good jobs? What are good jobs? What's a bad job? What would make people commit to bad jobs? So again, for men that by and large had been in prison, had been involved in gang activity, had indeed very violent past, the set of questions I brought to them were very straightforward, very different, lend themselves to immediate feedback, immediate commentary. And indeed, for many of these men, surprised that this is all I wanted to know for them to earn $25. Third set of questions had to do with their own sense of prospects. What's a good job for you? How do you think you'll get a good job? Do you think you'll get a good job? What in particular do you need to know or do to get a good job? What does the American dream mean for you? So again, a set of very straightforward, very basic questions that in some cases were answered by men over a period of a few days, for some men over a period of a few months, but all arranged by this social contract that upon completion of the interview, they would receive $25 in cash. A welcome reward for chatting with some guy with a tape recorder and a microphone about these questions. Now, to illustrate some of the points about this research, I turned to 4 cases, perhaps best referred to as ideal typical cases in this research agenda. And the point will be made after we hear some of what they had to say. First case is a gentleman who I refer to as Billy. He had minimal contact with his father growing up in the Henry Horner homes. Superficial contact with his stepfather that resided with the family for a brief period during his early childhood. His mother was a security guard who worked inconsistently throughout his early childhood. Billy got involved with drug distribution while in high school and was very quickly forced out of that activity because he wasn't gang affiliated. So the more organized gang networks simply told him he had to discontinue his practice. And he did. Dropped out of high school shortly thereafter. At the point in time that I met Billy, age 21 at the time that I met him, he had not had any formal employment in his life. Another case, Danny. The oldest of 3. Danny explained to me that early in his life, he was kept indoors by an extraordinarily overprotective mother that didn't want him exposed to the dangers of life in Henry Horner homes. But Danny grew up on one of the lower floors in his house, in his apartment building, and so was able to climb out the window and jump down into the street and associate with young people. He claimed that he got punished when his mother caught him, but that was okay because it provided him with access to the streets. That access, as Danny went on to explain, resulted in his becoming one of the youngest members of a Vice Lord faction by his early adolescence. He said that began in his effort to cross a gang boundary to visit his cousins. He said he was repeatedly attacked by youth who took him to be a Vice Lord member because he lived on the side of Henry Horner that was proliferated by Vice Lords. So as he explained to me, he did what he thought these young men already decided that he had done, which was become a Vice Lord. And that led to a life experience that resulted in Danny having been expelled or voluntarily removed from all of the 4 area high schools that the Henry Horner homes feeds into on the west side of Chicago. He had been in prison for a short period. Again, Danny is 20 years old at the time that I met him. And at the time that I met him, lived with his girlfriend her 2 children from previous involvements, and a child of his own with his girlfriend. Danny's mother was consistently unemployed during his rearing. And he intended to, at some point in his life, try to find a way of making a better world for his mother, as well as his girlfriend, who he intended to marry, and these 3 children, although 2 of which he had no blood relations. He incorporated all the children in this notion of his family. Third case, a gentleman I call Ken, oldest of 3, moved into Henry Horner as a small boy. Had no contact with his father while growing up. In fact, explained to me that he saw his father for the first time 5 years prior to our meeting. Ken was 24 years old at the time, had just acquired a job as a forklift operator at one of the few remaining factories on the west side of Chicago. His own experience with gangs had resulted in early joining of the same Vice Lord faction that Danny was a member of. Ken did not complete high school, in fact was expelled because, as he explained, a shotgun went off in his locker during a period of heightened gang activity during his high school years. And after being expelled from high school, simply did not return. Ken had also been incarcerated, but having acquired a job shortly before I met him, felt that life would pretty much balance out for him and that he was on his way to some good things. The last individual, a young man I call Leroy, was one of the few men of the 60-some-odd that I interviewed in this project who had both parents at home as he was growing up. Both worked at minimally skilled jobs throughout his youth. Leroy was one of 4 kids. All of his siblings were gainfully employed except for him. And he explained to me that he spent much of his childhood actually fighting to stay out of gangs. In fact, got expelled from one of the area high schools because he stabbed a gang member who was aggressively trying to recruit him for a particular faction of the Vice Lord Nation. And Leroy was a very imposing figure, about 6'4", I'd guess in the area about 230 pounds. So it was a clear asset to any of the gang factions. But as he explained, he wanted nothing to do with gangs while growing up, and his effort to remove himself from gang influences actually resulted in the same kind of negative outcomes that in fact occurred for many of the men who were in gangs. Now, as a means of getting some sense of the differences in thinking about work mobility, and opportunities, let me start first with the individual I call Billy. Again, the ex-drug dealer, the young man who had not worked a job in his life. I asked him at one point in our conversation, do you think that rich and poor people get along well in society? After a long pause, he said, I don't know. If I was rich, I'd get along well. I guess they get along well. Well, do you think it's possible to move from one category to another? To go from poor to rich? Yeah, it's possible. What does it take? You just want to do it. You just have to want to do it. Billy couldn't follow up with any more explicit or enriched commentary on that point. So a bit later on, I asked him, do you think that people are equal in society? He said, I don't know. Is everybody treated equally, I asked him. Do you think? Don't seem like it. Well, what makes you feel that way? Because if you ain't got it, you ain't got it, you know? That ain't equal. I mean, that ain't treated right, you know? That's like you ain't having a chance. When you got something, you got something. When you ain't got nothing, you ain't got nothing. That's the way I think about it, you know? Well, do you think you were treated fairly in society? I guess so. I guess I'm treated fairly. I guess. Later on, I asked him, do you think anybody could get a good job in society? If they try, he said. Well, what does it take to get a good job? Like I say, you just want to do it. You know, you can go all out and do what it takes to get the good job, you know? Don't stop. Just go all the way. Keep trying till you get it. Yeah, I just want to get in and get out, you know? That's it for me, get in and get out. When you say get in and get out, what do you mean? Whatever it takes to live, you know? Do it and go on, you know? Go about my business and be set, you know? Later on, I asked him about comparisons between social groups in American life. One such question was, are there any groups that have more advantages or less advantages than black men? I don't know, he said. And he paused. I know it's out there, though. I know it's there, but I don't know what it is. What makes you feel it's out there, I asked him. Because it got to be out there. It's out there. Because just like the whites is having it, I mean, it's out there. People that you see that's doing better than you, it's out there. It had to be out there. You know, they are right. It's out there. And before I go on, understand that Billy was an individual that had essentially never set foot in any meaningful way beyond the confines of the Near West Side for his life experience. While one might imagine a poor black man from this community to be ripe with anger, hostility about his situation, Billy appeared to have, for many of my critical questions, very little to say about what was going on, either with respect to who gets treated fairly or who gets ahead. At some moments, he made clear that something out there is attainable. There is that better life out there. But not a very clear, not a very focused elucidation of how one accesses that. In many ways, Billy's story was like Leroy, who also had not worked, also spent no meaningful time away from the Near West Side of Chicago. At one moment in our discussion, I asked Leroy, as a black man, how do you think American society looks at you? He responded after a pause, man, I really can't say, man. I mean, break it down to me. Explain it to me right so I can understand what you're trying to say. How do you think, you're looked at by others as a black man? Oh, well, as a black man, me? Well, at least, he all right. I ain't no gangbanger or nothing, so they look at me like I'm not into that, no gangbanging stuff like that. So they can look at me and say, well, that's a nice young man right there. I asked him later on, well, do you think white society has an image of you in any way? No, I don't think so, he said. Do you feel you've ever been a victim of discrimination? Nope. Do you think that you're in any way at an advantage by being a black male? For that, am I at an advantage? Yeah. Do you mean does it help you? Does it help you in any way to be a black man? Well, I'm black. I mean, I can't change that, Jack, so I could be down, but I mean, man, I got advantages being a black man because the black man can do as much as the white man can do. Any man. I'm not prejudiced or nothing, I mean, it's all up here in your mind. If you can put your mind to it, you can do it. Now, taking Leroy's case, we see that at moments when he's directly asked to assess himself as a black man in society, he can't respond to the question in any way that takes race in any kind of complex form. And I'm asked to repeat the question or rephrase the question. In the end, he says, well, I'm not a gangbanger, I'm an all right kind of guy. I imagine folks would see me as a nice guy. No consideration, no sense of race being meaningful and how he's read in the social world. When I asked about discrimination, a sense of white society having image of him, his answer is no, or I don't know. Again, an inability to register vivid, rich depictions of how he thinks he may be regarded by the outside world. Leroy, like Billy, a life experience from the Near West Side. Living in the same apartment complex, attending schools they could walk to, as young adults with no jobs, hanging out on the same street corners day after day. And my coming from the University of Chicago to this community, I traveled throughout more parts of Chicago than these men had substantive interactions with in their 20-some-odd years of living. Yet as we turn to the two other cases, two men that had considerable more experience with life beyond the Near West Side of Chicago. That experience was centered in incarceration and in conflicts with state authorities. And so we're not talking about access to the good life, but experiences that were something other than everyday interaction on the Near West Side of Chicago. We start first with Ken, the ex-gang member who was just beginning his job as a forklift operator. I asked him, you think it's possible for people to move up in society? He said, yeah, but it's hard, you know? Well, what does it take? Man, well, a whole lot of ass kissing, you know? A lot of tricking, you know? Man, listen, being slick. And I'm serious. That's the only way I can see it, you know? Because you be out here and you're calling yourself going to be honest, and you go about it in the wrong way, and then you see some other motherfucker come in, excuse me, but you see somebody else come in, and you know you're breaking your neck to get there, and then somebody else come in fresh off the street and making more money than you know? Ain't got better skills, but he's making more money than you, because he's like this one. And when he said this one, he pointed to a picture of the then governor of Illinois, excuse me, Jim Edgar. We were in an alderman's community office, so it made perfect sense there'd be a picture of political figures. And so he constantly would point to the governor of Illinois as his reference to white society anytime he wanted to make a point. So he said, making more money than you, ain't got better skills, but making more money than you, because he's like this one. Another point I asked him, do you think people are equal in American society? He said, nope, not at all. And what makes you feel that way? Because you can see our brothers and sisters are treated against, you know, whites. And Mexicans, man, it's not like Mexicans, they even feel that they're better than us, you know, better than brothers and sisters. So that's why I feel no, ain't no way it's equal. Another point in time I asked him, do you see yourself in any way at an advantage by being a black man? Huh, an advantage of being a black man? Yeah, you know how to survive. You learn how to survive being a black man because it's just that hard for you. You gotta survive, you know? It make you survive. And you know, I think about this all the time. If I ever have to, you know, I believe in life after death. If I ever have to come back, I always want to come back like this one here, pointing to the governor again. Because I want to get my chance, you know, to own somebody. And I'm serious. Now clearly in Ken's case, no hesitancy, no confusion, no absence of clarity in configuring race and conflict in his understanding of how the world works. We can put on the table for a minute whether his readings are accurate. In fact, for the analytical objectives of my talk, whether his readings are accurate or not are really irrelevant. The point is that, unlike our first two cases, we have someone that, given a life experience of gang involvement, incarceration, repeated interaction with agents of the state, police officers, what have you, and now the beginnings of a work experience where he's dealing with supervisors, managers, what have you, right? A very different day-to-day situation than our first cases, and hence a very different reading of conflict and constraint and mobility. Danny, our other gang member, as a black man, how do you think society looks at you? I think they look at me not as my people, but to the racists, they look at me like I'm the enemy. They feel that we blacks is all out to get them, which I believe like this: I'm is out to get them. You feel you are out to get them? Yes. How come? Because they're getting too much money. We fought for the United States, not them. We went to war. We got to stand up for our rights. We're not getting treated right. We're not even getting equal rights. Later on, I asked him, do you see yourself in any way at an advantage by being black? After a puzzled look, I said, do you think there's anything that's positive or helpful about being blacks? Immediately he said, yeah, blacks are smarter than whites. Blacks learn from experience. Whites didn't. Whites, they can get a job because they know someone. A black person, I bet you can't pay a white person to fix a car because they don't know nothing they're doing. They got to pay $1,300 just to go to the school or try to learn when you could have the education by looking, listening, and learning and watching another person. So again, a very clear racial script in his interpretation of everyday reality. Now these points also carried over in my discussions about what these men saw for themselves, and whether and if so, how they imagined acquiring a better life for themselves. I'll share a few remarks here before tying this whole discussion up. First, return to Leroy. At a moment I asked him, do you feel that you have any particular skills or talents right now? I don't know, he said. I never gave that a thought. But how important is it for you to have a good paying job in the future, I asked. Man, real important. The way it's going today, man, real important. Because I don't want to be living on the street, Jack, or no alleys or nothing. Man, I got to eat. But do you have any sense of what kind of jobs you think you might have in the next 5 to 10 years? I ain't really gave that no thought neither, man. Sometimes I think I'll go back to school, man. That's what I've been thinking about a lot, man. But you know, I ain't choosy neither. I mean, whatever job comes that's a good paying job, I'm gonna jump on it. I ain't choosy. I mean, it ain't gotta satisfy me. As long as I'm working, man, taking care of myself. It's all right. I don't care what it is. Well, how much yearly income do you think it would take to provide a comfortable life for yourself? I really can't say, man. I really don't have an answer for that question. A bit later, I asked him, well, how would you describe what you want? I'd like to get away from around the projects. I'd like to have my own apartment, man. You know, my own place. I'd come home and just relax. I'd like to have something like that. A little car. I don't have a license, but I know how to drive, you know? So I'd like to have that too. I'd be satisfied with that. What do you think is the potential for you to have this happier life in the future? Man, if I could just move out of them projects, man, and get my own spot, get a nice paying job, man, I believe I'd be satisfied. Because what more can I ask for? I mean, I'd be satisfied with that right there, you know? And another moment I asked him about a notion of the good life, or the American dream, whether those terms made any sense for him. And he said, well, the good life for me, man, just like I said, get out of the projects. I mean, that right there is like a dream, man. Like I could talk about it, but I know it ain't gonna come true. I'd probably want a lot, man. Swimming pool, big old house, backyard, man, you know? Well, have you thought about leaving the city, trying to go someplace else? Man, a bunch of times, Jack. I used to, especially trying to get away from the projects. But it seems like I'm always ending up back there because I grew up over here. I don't mind visiting. This is where I grew up. I wouldn't mind visiting at all, but I just don't want to be staying around here all my life. I want to go somewhere. But it just seems like I always end up back here, and that just kills me. It seems like something just keeps keeping me here, keeps pulling me back. And there ain't nothing I really got to do here. But it seems like there must be something I have to do here because I just keep ending up back here. So is there something I got to do here or what, you know? I just seem to always be here, and I hate it. Now, Leroy's case, again, an individual who had not experienced life beyond the near West Side. Everything that's talked about in terms of a better job, a better possibility, all grounded in the notion of getting away from what he's currently experienced. Beyond saying a big house, a car, the only details that come in his narrative are trying to escape that which he already knows, life in the projects. No clear articulation about how to move, no clear articulation about how to attain that better life. Only this constant return to this notion of wanting to leave that which he continues to experience. Contrast that with Danny, our gang member. What do you think you want to do with your life in the future? The main thing I want to be is a good father to my kids and to my wife. So is there anything you're trying to do to get your situation together? Yeah, right now I'm trying to get myself an education. And before I come up off these papers that I'm on, he was on probation at the time I talked to him. And once I get off these papers, I'm leaving out of Chicago to start over again in Mississippi. The atmosphere there, because it's better down there that way. So you want to go to Mississippi, I asked him? Yeah. And what's better down there for you, you think? It's better down there for me because I don't have to hear that confusion that's going on now, and I ain't got a gangbang. It's a country part where I could build like I want to live and do what I want to do. So later on I asked him, so if you could do life over again, you wouldn't gangbang? He said, absolutely. But do you feel there's a way for you to stop now as long as you're in Chicago? Only if you live in Chicago? No, there's not a way you can stop gangbanging. You know why? Everywhere you go, you campaigning with someone. If you was to walk down the street with me in my neighborhood and another car ride past until you hanging with me, they'll say you a vice lord, referring to me, and you ain't nothing. That's just the way people think. That's the way our community is. That's just like with whites. I figure all whites are disciples. That's the rival gang faction in Chicago. All whites stick together no matter what. And I know this for a fact because when I was in jail, a Latin disciple and a Latin king, now understand that kings are an affiliation of the vice lords. A Latin disciple and a Latin king, both of these as white persons fought one black brother. Two different gangs. They're supposed to be fighting each other. But you're going to pull up this black brother because both of you whites stick together. I can say that much. But us blacks, we killing each other. Now, let me just say for a minute, it's interesting that he, although defines these people as Latinos, incorporates them with this larger notion of whites. Again, a very particularly Chicago perspective on racial dynamics that unfold in a community that is overwhelmingly black, 99% black, right? Latinos are viewed as a part of that external community, whites. So in casual conversation, a couple. Hence he does that in his conversation. I asked him about his particular skills or talents. The skills that I have a few skills, typing, fixing things mostly. But have you thought about a good paying job in the future? Yeah, that's something I definitely need. And what makes you feel that way? Because I have a family. But what chance do you think you have for finding a good paying job in like the next 5 years? Very bad. And what makes you feel that way? Because where could a guy like me with the background that I carry get a job in 5 years? Do you think there's any way of improving your situation? It won't do no good. So you think going out of the city would help? Yes. You think it would give you a chance to start over again maybe? Right. It's just like a second life. Now, unlike Leroy, Danny is very clear about the obstacles standing in his way. He discusses this notion of Mississippi as being the better life. Mississippi is where his mother was born. He'd never been there, right? He only has images of Mississippi being everything that the near west side of Chicago is not. Must be green down there because Chicago's full of cement. Open, country, fresh air because Chicago is consolidated, bad quality air, turbulence, and violence. So this notion of Mississippi as being the better is really a configuration based upon his mother telling him about this other place that was a part of her early childhood. But in talking more specifically about his case, Danny is very clear. Things in his mind are not going to work for him because he knows what he's up against in Chicago. He knows what it's meant to be a gang member, to have the kind of public image and persona that he carries, and hence he says very clearly at the age of 20, nothing's going to work for me in this city. Again, we can question the extent to whether Danny's reading his life correctly or not. Analytically, what's at stake is the severe distinctions between what Leroy has to say in reading his prospects and his inability to talk about anything other than getting away from where he is, versus Danny, who very clearly and very deliberately says, it's not going to work for me in this city. I see what I'm up against. What this all points to, by way of conclusion, is the importance of taking into account the extreme micro in considering this dimension of cultural inquiry, this project on meaning making, on belief formation. In presenting these 4 ideal typical cases to you, I talk about individuals who might appear to be of the same attitude, the same demeanor, perhaps engage in the same kind of frivolous activities if you were to observe them on street corners in the near west side. Yet there were some very different distinctions in their life histories, some very critical distinctions in their patterns of social interaction. Incarceration and intimate connection with power figures being the case for 2 cases, the absence of incarceration, but the extreme sedimentation in the community being the case for the other 2. It meant, in the case of the individuals who had been incarcerated, a very easy means of talking about conflict, contrast, as the ways of getting ahead, as what constitutes formal barriers or obstacles, not just for mobility in the larger sense, but in their own particular cases. For the individuals that didn't experience this same form of conflict, this same form of tension, a much lesser capacity to talk about conflict, right? More vague, more open-ended comments about obstacles, barriers, in many cases simply saying that they could not articulate whether and how they existed. Now, what does this mean for the 2 ends that I talked about earlier on in terms of research, the more policy-centered and the scholarly? First, in terms of policy, it means that there is certainly a greater space for thinking about how low-income African-American men, and indeed poor people more generally, contemplate and configure their own future prospects if we suspend an interrogation of the exotic or the fantastic dimensions of their lives and simply focus on how they make sense of the common sense dimensions of living that we perhaps think about or have made sense of in our own lives. That we begin to understand more clearly and have the space to take into consideration more fully what it is that individuals feel they're up against, or what it is they may not be recognizing at all in the possibilities for their engaging a better life. It should be clear that I don't intend that simply changing their worldviews, changing their belief systems, is all that needs to unfold for better life prospects to emerge. But if there were opportunities for better life prospects for these men, some sense of how they operate as cognitive actors, how they think about mobility and possibility, has to play into the consideration of how they're going to perhaps adjust to the means and mechanisms for uplift. It also means that we can think more critically about how race and other external factors do shape the everyday ideas, opinions, worldviews of individuals. So that what's striking is that in the case of two of our men, an inability to talk substantively, significantly about race emerged because they lived in a hyper-racially segregated context. So rather than simply saying, well, race can't be an issue or race cannot matter, Billy and Leroy say it's the case. We can understand how the very structural dynamics of race have created for them the incapacity to talk in profound ways about how race and other external factors may matter. Intellectually, what's at stake here is that a research orientation towards worldviews, towards beliefs, towards meaning-making, that tends to center on more privileged, perhaps more wealthy populations, can show some fruitful outcomes if brought back down a few notches to people who operate without certain resources, to people who don't operate in positions of privilege or power. And in that way, a more rich, a more dynamic conversation in the academy on cultural inquiry can unfold. It is those two outcomes, reshaping a public discussion of low-income black men and reshaping an intellectual discussion around issues of culture and cultural inquiry, that I hope my work will facilitate. And I hope this conversation brings to you my sense of how that can be done. Thank you very much.
I guess we'll just open it up for questions. And I'll let you.
Sure.
Try to relate just to see if I understand. They're so far down the hole, the people that you talked about, they're so far down the hole away from a margin where they could escape it economically or socially, that it doesn't even occur to them that there is such a margin or a border to cross over. They don't even see that except the one fellow with his dream of Mississippi.
Well, some of the men who, again, had been to jail, had conflict with police, they can talk about obstacles of barriers. They have a better sense, by way of talking about what they cannot achieve, are very clear about what is achievable for other people. So a part of Danny's story, for instance, as much as he talks about this is what cannot happen for me, this is what I'm going to suffer by way of my public record of being a gang member, he's very much aware that other people have access to certain power positions, right? Certainly the police, the penal system, those institutions he's been exposed to. But for some of these other men, right, who again have literally never left the neighborhood, that's the case. People have some notion of there being privilege out there, there being power out there, right? Billy talks about, I want to get it. And that's the extent of it. The it is the entire composite of that better life.
That's kind of the question then on your conclusion. I think I missed it then. Take these people that have not even had the exposure of jail and the other nice experiences of that. What do you do to reach them?
I think you have to commit to a more profound educative process than what some of the contemporary job training or job placement initiatives that are currently unfolding promote. So that essentially we're talking about a set of young men that have had no access to mainstream employment spheres. Right? Transferring these folks into work would be like putting us all on the planet Mars. And one of the points that I make more fully in the book is that we do an injustice if we simply think about this problem as one of a lack of motivation or the right ethics, or if people are so vague or so distant in their understandings of what we consider to be mainstream, then their capacity to function effectively in that arena is going to be damaged. And that irrespective of how hard they try, and so there's got to be some additional educative dynamics that accompany that.
Culture shock. It's like they're from another planet.
Right. And so, and you know, the desires in which these men had to meet me and do these interviews and make this money, I was convinced many men wanted to go to work. They wanted to sit down and talk to me and do whatever they could. Some men wanted to work for me in this project. You know, is there some way, you know, I could be, you know, do whatever it is, you know, what kind of job this is where you just talk to people. So, you know, all these things unfolded through the course of this research. But the real question is, what does it mean to be distant, to experience, you know, not just for the moment, but have a life historical experience of distance in that way?
Within the context of their life experiences, is there any sense that they are shaping goals for themselves of any kind within that context?
For most of the guys, only the most general. You know, the goal is stability. And they don't talk about it in more specific ways because there's really no sense. But they want income, they want a domicile, that they want stability. So.
On October 1st of this year, 2002, the 1996 Welfare Reform Act is up for reauthorization. Sunsets in September. And today in the New York Times, President Bush outlaid his proposal for what he wants to push in the new set of standards that hopefully will be enacted. And one of those standards is an up in the work requirement for people who receive TANF aid from 30 to 40 hours, 30 hours a week to 40 hours a week, while allowing an up in like vocational time from 10 hours to 16 hours, but the up requirement would be 40 hours. And how do you think, if passed, this would impact the people in the population that you study, if at all, what ramifications?
I find those debates so far removed from the lived experience of the people I deal with that, in essence, it's going to, for this population, make an already perceived to be outlawed constituency even further outlawed. All the things that I just said in terms of an educative dynamic have never really been a part of these policy initiatives to begin with. So they just sort of up the ante in terms of how many hours people have to go to work. Doesn't address the questions that I posed in the first place. They don't address the question of the transformation of work opportunity in the urban sphere. As these young men were growing up, 70,000 jobs left this community. 70,000 jobs in a 20-year period left this community. So we're talking about men that are used to seeing businesses shut down. Right? Their every day is that people stop work. And the DC-centered discussion is really grounded in hours spent at work and motivation to get to work. So, and I'm very clear, I think what I present is in no way a part of the discussion that the DC-centered folks want to have, which in some ways is why it's safer to have it in the academy. Can we go this way now?
Yeah, I just want to thank you for your talk. I thought it was really interesting. One of the things that struck me as you were talking about sort of giving these low-income black men the opportunity to see other realities, it just seems like a little bit messed up that an effort has to be made to give them more of an opportunity to see other realities when most of the folks going to universities like this one of privilege, white, don't even understand class or race in the same ways. And I guess my question is there a deeper question beyond just, you know, giving these folks the opportunity to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and a necessity to look at more, you know, how do we as a society become more conscious of those questions of race and class?
Yeah. No, clearly, I mean, I fully agree with you. There were a set of deeper questions, right? I intervene with a population that, as I said in the beginning, is at a moment of crisis. Right? So I like to see folks feeding themselves. So consequently, and I don't take it as far as you're talking about, but that would be the natural follow-through in thinking about how it is that, you know, across America, in fact, we're living lives of isolation. Right? The folks with access to higher education got a lot more capital and hence don't suffer the consequence of isolation. In some ways benefit from it because so many other people are removed from accessing the positions we access or aspire to. But at its extreme, it does point to the kind of reconsiderations that you're talking about power and prestige and how we think about other people.
Al, this is sort of a fuzzy question, but I'm curious about your theorizing about the symbolic, formation of symbolic, or using the symbolic apparatus to understand meaning making. And I, not to go in the direction of public policy, but it was interesting with the 4 case studies that you gave us, right? 2 of the men had been institutionalized. And we found that those 2 men were more articulate than the 2 men who hadn't been institutionalized. And I wondered if there's some implications there. I mean, because the way that the research could be, you know, sort of understood and used, we're talking about, you know, I mean, urban education across the United States, nobody's graduated from high school. So that's an institution, in some ways, it's failed. So we're seeing an institution that's working, it's, you know, it's like the prison. The prison is enabling these men to understand their futures and to understand the conflicts and the resistance. And I wondered if there is some way that we could theorize maybe questions that we ask people when we are conducting research, or ways of understanding the responses, so that we could get something out of the inarticulate people who haven't been institutionalized. In other words, like, so that it doesn't always, so that the, you know, I mean, we represent institutions of higher education, and so that it doesn't seem like, you know, we can only sort of have a dialogue with people who have something in common with us. Do you, I mean, do you sort of see the direction I'm trying to go?
I think so.
But I'm just wondering if there's anything more that any other way to sort of think about incorporating a diverse body of responses. I mean, I was wondering when you gave the talk, if it would have been a positive, or not positive, but if it would have been an example of an articulate response from one of the people who hadn't been institutionalized. They said, well, you know, my goal is to become the leader of the Vice Lords and to have a drug operation that controls the west side of Chicago. Would that have been an example of him saying, this is what the good life would look like, you know, or so on and so forth? I mean, would that be something that we say, well, I mean, here's somebody who has, you know, navigated social reality and is capable of, you know, sort of projecting themselves into the American dream, so to speak.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, my data works against that, and I'll explain so in a minute. On the one hand, virtually all of the gang members have been incarcerated at some point, which, when you think about it, is not surprising. Most low-income black men have been incarcerated at some point, so the fact that there were a number in this set that weren't, with the, you know, odd cases. But what was striking, and I think this has to do with the age category that I dealt with, I chose 20 to 25-year-olds because I wanted people that were young enough to perhaps think about a long-term future, but old enough to have some sense of an adult identity already established, right? And what was striking is even for some of those gang members that I talked to that had done pretty, I mean, I met a couple guys that don't actually appear in this work, but own houses, you know, things had gone very well. And they almost always have said, I would have rather done it another way, that there was too much at risk. You know, I'm looking over my shoulder, guys who had become parents, you know, I could get killed. And so, you know, no one sort of stopped at saying that, you know, putting it all together through this way was the best way or the most satisfying way. Everybody sort of reached a point by their early to mid-20s where they said, you know, it may have happened, but ideally I want it to happen another way. If you had asked me when I was 17 this question, I'd say something different. But at 24, 25, that's not the case. Getting back to the first point of your question, and I realize this always runs a risk when you draw the ideal typical cases along this way. One of the things I try to make clear, and perhaps I can still do more work on this, is at the same time in which I'm pointing out how those 2 cases were not as profound or provocative about race or constraints, what have you, that what they have to say certainly isn't insignificant. So that's what I'm trying to get at the conclusion, is that there's a lot analytically at stake in hearing black men from the west side of Chicago, from an impoverished neighborhood, say, I've never been discriminated against because I've never dealt with anyone other than black people. Or I don't know what white people think of me. So at a certain level, that's a less provocative, a less elaborate commentary. At another level, it's highly provocative and highly significant for understanding the realities of urban living. And so I try to remind on that front so that it doesn't look like I'm saying simply that these folks don't have it as much as these other folks do who have lived the more conflict-ridden life.
I mean, just to think about the richer life is the life of interacting with the institutions, and the institutions are always, punitive apparatus of the state.
Right.
And I mean, is that the thing that grants powers of articulation? I mean,
Well, no, I think the extent to which you have access to people unlike yourselves, and this actually is a nice entree in the book too, which I'll be working on this summer, which is a select case of what I call rags to riches cases. Guys from this neighborhood that have done very well. They were all college graduates or in grad school. And what's interesting is they have the same narrative as my gang members did. They talk extensively about discrimination, conflict, you gotta hustle or you gotta do things. The difference is their institutional attachments are with sites that enrich one's capital, that help build capital for getting ahead, whereas incarceration diminishes. So it's not simply, I think you get the same messages, or you can crystallize images of constraint, difficulty, what have you, to the extent to which you have access to people outside of your circumstances, and the extent to which you have some intimate sense of how much power, privilege, and opportunity is out there. But depending on which institutional attachment you have, you're either going to build capital to allow yourself to perhaps access those things, or stigmatize yourself and prevent access. The guys that went to jail, of course, are stigmatized. Ken's the only ex-convict that has a job, that ever had a job in this data set. Most of the other men said, because I went there, I'm never going to get a real job. Right? But yet their narratives are the same as the guys that went to college. And just to fill you all in, these guys tended to, through sports, find their way through. So these were the athletes that studied hard as well, with the 20-some-odd cases that'll be a part of book 2. But the same narrative about, running into privileged people and thinking about how they dealt with things, unlike people in the neighborhood, what have you. So.
Al, it seems like you're calling for a certain level of race consciousness among the very isolated low-income black men, where some of your cases, some of your respondents have a kind of race consciousness, and others don't. But I'm wondering, are there any nuances to that? Are you advocating a certain perspective, a certain kind of consciousness about race, as opposed to the sort of debilitating one that says that, it's all the cards are stacked against me type of race consciousness? All of the odds are against me because I'm black. I heard one respondent say something about, well, of course there are advantages to being black, but they're smart. That, sort of seeing a little bit of ingenuity as a benefit to being black or to race. But I'm wondering, what did the race consciousness get? Some of the respondents who had it, how did it translate for them into a more positive outcome, aside from the awareness of?
Okay, I see two questions here, and correct me if I'm not responding back correctly. I'll deal with what I see as the second question, which has to do with the fact that because all these men are so down and out, that consciousness in essence means almost nothing in terms of getting ahead at this stage. Right? The structural realities of their lives are such that there aren't opportunities that they have great access to in the first place. So anything that might happen is preconditioned upon a radically changed social world for the near west side of Chicago, and by extension for urban America, that would create the possibilities in the first place. But the core question, and this ties in with one of the main theses in the book, is that it's not simply how high the stack of oppositions one imagines, but how much they imagine the capacity to tackle that stack that matters. And toward that end, that's a bit of a challenge to some standing research that tends to say, well, if people think the problem is too big, you know, they're going to bail out. I argue through this work, and it's fairly conditional because I realize that methodologically speaking, there's not a large sample, what have you, but I'm not ready to surrender to the notion that if you imagine the problem is too big, you'll submit. If you imagine a strategy for confronting the problem, no matter how big you conceive it to be, then you may be able to do so. And hence it is that meaning-making dynamic that becomes all the more important.
Nobody else.
Oh,
I grew up in Chicago, and so 25 years it might have changed, but the idea of sorting this out, to look for, like the gentleman said, a deeper question, it sounds to me you're talking about people, again, that are so far down that I ask you your visceral reaction. I bet you could go into some of those white areas on the west side of Chicago and almost get the same response.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it, actually. On the basis of some of my colleagues that do some similar work. And again, because Chicago is such a segmented city, I mean, people just don't casually walk across neighborhoods. They're viaducts, they're railroads.
The whites would see themselves as far removed.
Right, but I'm saying because they're in geographic spaces that don't allow that kind of mobility.
Neutralized race,
Right,
haven't you,
right.
on what you're looking for, about what makes us tick.
I would tend to disagree with that to this extent, that not only would the black male be isolated, but invisible, which is a difference between poor whites and poor blacks. And that your question regarding welfare reform, where the government does not look at the black male that's attached, who made this baby, who is now his recipient of assistance, does not look at the male as a resource, but only addresses females. And the government will train the females in jobs, but there is not equal access to males in this kind of training ability. So I wonder if you might address these men in relationship to their lost roles as breadwinners.
Okay, right. Let me just say, I thought though you were talking about two different issues, really. Yours being more of how men thought about themselves or more worldviews. Yours centering on how the public takes account of these populations.
No, it's the same, because I'm just saying that I don't think that that with
Excuse me.
white low-income males, they are not invisible. They might,
Unless maybe they get so pushed down the pipe so far that both of them reach the same darkness, that whether you're black or white, they're both
I can
equally
see the
invisible.
same hopelessness to a certain extent.
But I mean, even the structure, the white structure society of Chicago might see these Polacks on the west side just as invisible, is my question.
A work that helps get at that is racial situations on low-income whites in Detroit. So it's interesting, John Hardigan is the author. It's an interesting play on this sort of, Detroit being the contemporarily the black city of America and this low-income white population, where many of those same issues come to surface. I mean, analytically, the project is about some very different questions, but it gets at that whole question of folks saying, no one would ever register us as being a meaningful part of the city because of what Detroit appears to be. But we're out of work and we're down and out, and some of those discussions emerge there. Getting back to your point, though, and it again touches upon some of the core issues that shape how these men have thought about their prospects, is particularly around this notion of fatherhood. Right? Clearly, almost every one of the men I talked to was a parent. Right? That, as much as incarceration, parenthood for men of this age group is a reality. And one of the striking things is that all of the men talked about their becoming fathers, in many cases for the first time, as being that moment in which they began to think about themselves as adults, or at least contemplating what an adult life experience of poverty would be like. So that whole notion, although they never really argued much about what they thought they were able to do for their kids. In fact, many men expressed a lot of consternation about not doing anything at all for their children. There were some critical moments of their beginning to really think about what might be going on or what they should be called to do given that. So, and clearly I think there's space to think about that more fully. But this whole notion of trying to make sense of that role from this position of being, divorced from it in terms of what we imagine to be more mainstream notions, again, of fatherhood, that played a significant role as well.
One more question. Did you get a sense that racial consciousness was an adverse factor in people's, I don't know, I guess, social capital or advancement, material advancement? In other words, like, was the consciousness that there is anti-black racism in the United States something that, I mean, you touched on this, but something that gave them a feeling that there was something else that was a potential adversary, and that, or that it was a limiting factor as opposed to an enabling kind of sensibility?
No, again, it depended. If you're talking about the guys that I refer to as rags to riches cases, many of them talk about ways of confronting race that will facilitate positive outcomes or desired outcomes. So choosing professions that they thought, as black men, they could move in certain ways because they were black men. So a lot of it has to do with what kind of institutional attachments you've had access to that situate your exposure to race, that provide you with some capital for mobility, and then provide you with the space for thinking about how you navigate race. For the non-mobile men, almost not the case. Beyond talking about the fact that one had to confront racial dynamics. No sense that necessarily prepared them or would equip them. And again, think of what Danny was saying in terms of, where could a guy like me get a job? I mean, race was embedded in that whole narrative of what it meant for to be a gang member.
Limited possibility.
Right.
Or excluded possibility, potentially.
Yeah. Thank you.